The navigation console's diagnostic display flickered between amber warnings and complete system failure with the persistence of a malfunctioning Christmas tree, each blink accompanied by an electronic wheeze that suggested the hardware was experiencing some form of mechanical depression. Captain Nathan Cross tapped the screen with the kind of gentle coaxing usually reserved for ancient relatives who needed encouragement to remember their own names, which, given the advanced age and questionable reliability of Kepler-47 mining station, wasn't far from an accurate comparison. Chief Vasquez, please tell me you have something resembling good news about our communications array, he called across the cramped command center to Elena Vasquez, who was currently performing what could charitably be described as emergency surgery on a maintenance panel that had been threatening to achieve complete nervous breakdown for the past 3 weeks. Her legs protruded from the access hatch at an angle that suggested either remarkable flexibility or complete surrender to the demands of recalcitrant machinery. "Define good news, Captain," came her muffled reply, punctuated by the sound of something metallic being persuaded to cooperate through the application of what the maintenance manual probably referred to as percussive calibration. "If you mean the array isn't actively trying to electrocute me while I work on it, then yes, I have moderately encouraging news. If you mean we can actually establish contact with anything more distant than our own shuttle bay, then I'm afraid you're going to experience disappointment of a magnitude typically reserved for people who discover their lottery tickets are off by one number." Nathan sighed and leaned back in his command chair, a piece of furniture that had been designed by engineers who apparently believed that comfort was a luxury mining crews didn't deserve and ergonomics was a concept best left to people who worked in offices with windows. The chair protested his movement with a squeak that managed to convey both mechanical distress and personal offense, as if it blamed him for the indignities it had suffered during 18 months of continuous operation in an environment that could charitably be described as aggressively hostile to sophisticated machinery. "How long until the next scheduled supply run?" asked Dr. Morrison Zhang, their geological specialist and the closest thing they had to a scientist who hadn't been driven completely insane by the combination of isolation, recycled air, and dietary supplements that tasted like cardboard had been processed through someone's imagination of what food might be like. He looked up from a collection of mineral samples that he'd been examining with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for religious artifacts or evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence. 3 weeks and 2 days, assuming command remembers we exist, Nathan replied, consulting the duty roster display that flickered between accurate information and what appeared to be someone's grocery list from 6 months ago. Which, given our current communication status and the bureaucratic efficiency of the Colonial Mining Administration, is roughly equivalent to hoping the universe develops both a sense of humor and a commitment to reasonable customer service. "The universe already has a sense of humor," Chief Vasquez observed, emerging from the maintenance panel with grease streaks across her face that gave her the appearance of someone who had been wrestling with particularly stubborn machinery and achieved a draw. "It's just not the kind of humor that benefits people who have to work for a living." The mining station Kepler-47 operated in the crimson shadow of the Helix Nebula, a massive cloud of ionized gas and cosmic debris that painted their viewports in shades of red and orange while simultaneously making long-range communications nearly impossible and giving everyone's skin an unsettling ruddy tint that made them look like they were perpetually suffering from mild radiation poisoning. It was beautiful in the way that most dangerous things were beautiful. Spectacular to observe from a safe distance, potentially lethal to experience up close, and absolutely guaranteed to make life complicated for anyone foolish enough to establish a permanent presence in its vicinity. The nebula's electromagnetic interference meant that they operated in essential isolation for weeks at a time, dependent on their own resources and the hope that nothing catastrophic would happen before the next supply ship arrived with fresh food, replacement parts, and news from the outside universe. It was the kind of posting that attracted people who either craved solitude or had made career decisions that left them with limited alternatives, though Nathan had to admit the pay was excellent and the scenery, while potentially hazardous to electronic equipment, was undeniably impressive. "Contact." Ensign Brooks called from the sensor station, his voice carrying the kind of excitement that came from having something, anything, break the monotony of their daily routine. Brooks was young enough to still find unexpected sensor readings thrilling rather than ominous, which Nathan envied even as he recognized it as a luxury he could no longer afford. Unknown energy signature approaching from bearing 27 Mark 4, distance approximately 50,000 kilometers and closing. Nathan straightened in his chair, which responded with its usual chorus of mechanical complaints. Configuration analysis, Brooks. What are we dealing with? That's the peculiar part, sir. Brooks frowned at his instruments with the expression of someone who suspected his equipment might be playing an elaborate practical joke on him. I'm not detecting a conventional vessel at all. The signature reads as pure energy traveling through space at approximately 0.75 light speed, but it's maintaining a coherent form and demonstrating intelligent course corrections. Energy signatures don't travel through space independently, Ensign. They require some form of containment or propulsion system. Check your calibrations. I've run full diagnostics 3 times, Captain. The readings are consistent across all sensor arrays. Whatever's approaching us, it's not using any propulsion technology in our databases, and it's not showing up on visual or gravitic scanners. Dar. Zhang looked up from his geological samples with the expression of someone whose day had just become significantly more interesting than he'd anticipated when he woke up that morning. Could be a natural phenomenon. The nebula generates exotic energy patterns that sometimes exhibit behavior that mimics intelligence. I've documented 17 different types of plasma formations that appear to respond to external stimuli. Natural phenomena don't typically adjust their trajectories to intercept mining stations, Nathan observed, watching the tactical display as the mysterious signature made another course correction that brought it directly toward their position. The movement was too precise, too purposeful to be random. All hands to alert status. Brooks, bring our defensive systems online and somebody please tell me our plasma cannons are more functional than our communications array. Defensive systems are operational, Captain, Chief Vasquez reported, though her tone carried the kind of qualified optimism usually reserved for people discussing the reliability of used vehicles with suspicious histories. Though I should mention that our primary plasma cannons haven't been test-fired since we arrived on station, the targeting systems have been making concerning noises for the past week, and our shield generators are operating at approximately 60% efficiency due to power fluctuations that I haven't been able to trace to any specific source. Define concerning noises. Like a dying whale attempting to solve complex mathematical problems while experiencing significant digestive distress. The energy signature continued its approach, growing stronger on their sensors with each passing minute while maintaining its impossible characteristics. Nathan found himself oddly calm, perhaps because panic required more emotional energy than their current situation seemed worth expending, or perhaps because he'd reached the philosophical point in his career where he'd learned to accept that the universe had a tendency toward the inexplicable and fighting that tendency was usually more exhausting than productive. "Sir," Brooks called, his voice tight with the kind of disbelief that came from witnessing something that challenged fundamental assumptions about how reality was supposed to function. The energy signature it materialized inside the station. Deck 7, Corridor Junction Alpha 7. Materialized? As in appeared instantaneously, sir. One moment our internal sensors showed nothing unusual, the next moment there's a humanoid life form standing in the middle of the corridor. No transition period, no energy buildup, no indication of teleportation or phasing technology. Nathan exchanged glances with Chief Vasquez, who shrugged with the philosophical acceptance of someone who had learned through bitter experience that the universe rarely bothered to consult engineering manuals before deciding to violate the laws of physics. Any indication of hostile intent? Negative, Captain. The life form appears to be stationary. But sir, we're registering massive power fluctuations throughout that entire section. It's as if the presence itself is interfering with our electrical systems. Of course it is. Nathan stood and checked his sidearm, noting that its charge indicator was blinking amber, which meant it would either function perfectly when needed or fail catastrophically at the worst possible moment, depending on whatever cosmic sense of humor governed the reliability of military equipment in crisis situations. Chief, Dr. Zhang, you're with me. Brooks, monitor from here and be ready to implement emergency evacuation protocols if this situation deteriorates beyond our ability to manage it. How will I know if the situation has deteriorated beyond manageable parameters? Trust me, Ensign. When that happens, you'll know immediately and unmistakably. The corridors of Kepler-47 had been designed by engineers who apparently believed that aesthetic considerations were an unnecessary luxury for people who worked in space, and that the psychological effects of spending months surrounded by industrial gray and institutional beige were character-building rather than soul-crushing. Everything was painted in colors that suggested either a complete absence of imagination or a deliberate attempt to create an environment that discouraged lingering, with exposed conduits and maintenance panels that gave the impression of walking through the digestive system of some vast mechanical organism. As they approached Corridor Junction Alpha 7, Nathan noticed that the overhead lighting was flickering in patterns that seemed almost rhythmic, like the visual equivalent of a heartbeat translated into electrical impulses. The air itself felt different, charged with energy that made the hair on his arms stand up and created a sensation like standing too close to a powerful electrical transformer during a thunderstorm. Captain, Dr. Jean whispered, consulting a handheld scanner that was displaying readings in colors Nathan was fairly certain weren't supposed to appear on standard scientific instruments. I'm detecting electromagnetic fluctuations of a magnitude that exceeds our measurement capabilities. Whatever's generating this field has an energy output that's literally off the scale of our equipment. Define off the scale. As in my instruments are displaying error messages because they lack the capacity to quantify what they're detecting. It's like trying to measure the mass of a star using bathroom scales designed for personal use. They rounded the corner and stopped abruptly. Standing in the middle of the corridor was a woman who appeared entirely human except for her ears, which curved upward in elegant points that would have seemed perfectly at home in ancient mythology or children's fairy tales. She was tall and gracefully proportioned, dressed in clothing that seemed to be woven from shadow and starlight, creating patterns that shifted and flowed as she moved. Her beauty was otherworldly in a way that made Nathan's breath catch in his throat and his brain temporarily forget how to process visual information in any coherent manner. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate not just in his ears but in his bones, creating a sensation like listening to music played on instruments that existed in dimensions humans weren't equipped to perceive. I am Liana of the NYTH Mari. You must evacuate this station immediately. I am lethal to your species, and my continued presence here endangers the lives of all aboard this vessel. Nathan studied her carefully, noting the way her hands trembled slightly despite the authoritative tone of her voice, the way her eyes seemed to communicate something entirely different from her words. Her gaze held depths that suggested vast intelligence and even vaster loneliness, as if she were looking at them from across an impossible distance of both space and time. Well, he said finally, that's certainly the most direct introduction I've received in quite some time. I'm Captain Nathan Cross, and these are members of my crew. Before we discuss evacuation procedures, mind if I ask why someone who claims to be lethal to humans bothered to warn us about the danger instead of simply allowing nature to take its course? Something flickered across her features, surprise, perhaps, or confusion, as if his question had struck against something she hadn't expected to encounter in this situation. Her pointed ears twitched in a gesture that would have been endearing under circumstances that didn't involve potential mortal peril, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure showed hairline cracks that suggested vulnerability beneath the surface authority. You should be afraid, she said, though her tone carried less conviction than her words suggested. Your species' natural response to predators is terror followed by flight. I do not understand why you remain here asking questions when every instinct should be compelling you to flee. Probably because I've found that being afraid and being smart aren't always the same thing, Nathan replied, noting the way the corridor's lighting continued to flicker around her in patterns that seemed almost like a visual heartbeat. You say you're dangerous, but you also took the trouble to warn us about that danger. In my experience, genuinely dangerous beings don't usually announce their intentions in advance. That seems like a contradiction worth exploring before we start panicking. You do not understand the nature of what I am. Liana's voice carried undertones of what might have been grief or regret. My very presence drains the life force from organic beings. The longer you remain in my proximity, the weaker you will become, until eventually your biological systems will fail entirely. How long are we talking about? Nathan asked with the kind of practical curiosity that had served him well throughout a career spent dealing with various forms of cosmic inconvenience. Minutes? Hours? Days? Because if we're talking about days, I've got time for a few more questions, and if we're talking about minutes, I'd like to know what we're dealing with before I start making evacuation decisions that might be unnecessary. Dar. Zhang stepped forward, his scientific curiosity apparently overriding whatever survival instincts millions of years of evolution had thoughtfully provided him with. Liana, is that correct? Are you saying you're some form of energy vampire? Her pointed ears twitched again, and Nathan found himself oddly charmed by the gesture despite the circumstances. That is, a crude but not entirely inaccurate description of my species' relationship with other life forms. Fascinating. And you can control this effect to some degree? To some degree, yes. But proximity increases the danger exponentially, and emotional stress makes it more difficult to maintain control. Strong emotions can cause the energy drain to spike beyond my ability to regulate it. Nathan noticed that while the corridor's lighting continued to flicker erratically, none of them had collapsed or shown any signs of immediate health problems. Either she was significantly overestimating the danger she posed, or there was more to this situation than she was explaining. Liana, why don't you tell us why you're really here? Because something tells me this isn't a random encounter. Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment Nathan saw something in them that looked like hope struggling against resignation. I was passing through this system when I detected your energy signatures. Your species emits particular bioelectrical patterns that are difficult for my kind to ignore. Difficult how? Your life force resonates at frequencies that call to us. It is vibrant, warm, complex in ways that most organic life is not. We are drawn to it like creatures evolved in darkness might be drawn to light. Chief Vasquez, who had been listening to this exchange with the expression of someone trying to decide whether she was witnessing first contact or elaborate performance art, crossed her arms and fixed Liana with the kind of direct stare usually reserved for subordinates who were attempting to explain why critical equipment had mysteriously malfunctioned on their watch. So we're basically walking snacks to your people. That's reassuring. That is not entirely inaccurate, Liana admitted, her expression growing pained in a way that suggested she found this aspect of her nature deeply uncomfortable. But I did not come here to feed. I came to warn you, to give you the opportunity to flee before others of my kind detect your presence and arrive with less benevolent intentions. Nathan found himself studying her face more closely, noting the subtle interplay of emotions that flickered across her features like shadows cast by moving clouds. There was something achingly familiar about her expression, though he couldn't quite identify what it reminded him of. Others of your kind. How many others are we talking about? The NYTHMARI exist in scattered groups throughout this region of the galaxy. Most have embraced our predatory nature, forming hunting collectives that view other species as nothing more than sustenance to be consumed. I have spent the last 47 of your years in self-imposed exile, avoiding contact with other beings precisely because of what I am. 47 years of isolation. Nathan shook his head, trying to imagine what that kind of solitude would do to someone's psychological state. That sounds incredibly lonely. Loneliness is preferable to murder. Is it, though? The question emerged before Nathan could fully consider its implications. I mean, if you can control your abilities to some degree, and if the effects aren't immediately fatal, maybe there are other options worth exploring. You speak of things you cannot possibly understand. Then help me understand. Explain it to me. Nathan gestured toward the flickering lights around them. We're apparently stuck here anyway. Our shuttle's navigation system just went offline, probably because of those electromagnetic fluctuations you mentioned. So we've got time, and frankly, I'd rather spend it learning about the situation we're in than making assumptions that might get us all killed. Dr. Zhang checked his handheld scanner and frowned at the readings it displayed. He's correct about the navigation system. We're showing complete failure in the quantum compass array. We're not going anywhere until we can recalibrate the entire guidance network. Lioness carefully maintained composure cracked visibly, and Nathan saw something that looked like panic flash across her features. This is precisely what I sought to prevent. My presence here will trap you, slowly drain your strength and vitality until you lack the energy to maintain basic biological functions. Until we die, you mean? Until your life force is completely consumed, leaving only desiccated remains. Right. Or until we get really tired and need to take more frequent naps, Nathan said, noting that while he felt a strange tingling sensation in his extremities, he didn't feel particularly weak or endangered. Because so far, the most dramatic symptom I'm experiencing is the urge to ask more questions. You mock something that has claimed countless lives across the galaxy. I'm not mocking it. I'm trying to understand it, and I'm trying to understand you. There's a significant difference. Lioness stared at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through emotions Nathan couldn't quite identify but which seemed to involve some form of internal struggle between conflicting impulses. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, as if she were sharing secrets that had been locked away for decades. The NYTHMari were not always what we have become. Once, we were a proud civilization that explored the galaxy with wonder and curiosity. We established trade relationships, created art that could reshape reality itself, built cities that existed in harmony with the natural energy flows of entire star systems. We were scientists, philosophers, artists, beings who sought to understand and celebrate the complexity of existence. What changed? Contact with other species revealed the terrible truth about our nature. We discovered that our natural energy absorption, which we had always considered a benign biological function, was actually fatal to most other forms of organic life. By the time we understood what we were inadvertently doing, we had committed genocide on a scale that defied comprehension. Chief Vasquez let out a low whistle that somehow managed to convey both sympathy and alarm. That would definitely put a damper on the whole, proud civilization exploring the galaxy, thing. Some of my people embraced what we had become, Liona continued, her voice growing distant as if she were looking back across vast expanses of time and regret. They formed hunting collectives, abandoning any pretense of civilization and viewing other species as nothing more than sustenance to be consumed. They believed that if we were monsters by nature, we should be the most efficient monsters possible. And others? Others, like myself, chose exile. We scattered to the emptiest regions of space, as far from populated systems as we could manage, hoping that isolation would prevent us from causing further harm. How long have you been alone? Nathan asked, though something in her expression suggested he might not want to hear the answer. 47 of your years, as I mentioned. Though time becomes fluid when one exists in complete solitude for extended periods. 47 years. Nathan found himself genuinely shocked by the magnitude of that isolation. That's longer than I've been alive. Your species has remarkably brief lifespans. We measure existence in centuries, sometimes millennia. 47 years is relatively brief by our standards. Which makes 47 years of complete solitude even more tragic, Nathan observed. What did you do during all that time? I observed. I studied. I watched your colonies from a distance, learning about your social structures, your capacity for cooperation despite individual differences, your ability to find meaning and purpose in lives that span only decades rather than centuries. But you never approached. How could I? I am death walking among the living. I am a predator who feeds on the very essence of life itself. Nathan made a decision that his training manuals would probably have classified as either remarkably brave or criminally stupid, depending on how the situation ultimately resolved itself. He took a deliberate step closer to Liona, noting the way her eyes widened in alarm and her entire body tensed as if preparing to flee. You know what I think, he said, studying her face carefully. I think you're scared of more than just hurting us. Explain. I think you're terrified of what might happen if you don't hurt us. If it turns out that connection is actually possible after all, despite everything you've been taught to believe about your nature. Lionel's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or might have been hope, and the corridor's lighting flickered more intensely in response to whatever emotional turmoil she was experiencing. You understand nothing of my nature or the constraints it places upon my existence. Maybe not. But I understand loneliness, and I understand fear, and I understand the difference between someone who wants to hurt people and someone who's terrified of hurting people by accident. The tingling sensation Nathan had been experiencing intensified, spreading from his extremities toward his core, but it didn't feel unpleasant so much as unusual, like being gently electrified by something that existed at the intersection of physics and magic. You feel it now, Lionel said, her voice thick with something that sounded like grief mixed with resignation. The drain beginning. The slow dissolution of your life force. You should flee immediately while you still possess the strength to do so. Or, Nathan said, noting that while the tingling sensation was definitely present, he didn't feel weak or tired or in any immediate danger. Maybe we should try to figure out why I'm not collapsing like your theoretical framework suggests I should be. Dr. Zhang was scanning Nathan with his instruments, his expression growing more fascinated and confused with each reading he took. Captain, this is extraordinary. I'm detecting significant energy transfer between you and Lionel, but it's not following the unidirectional pattern she described. There appears to be some form of resonance developing between your bioelectrical fields. Resonance? Like harmonic frequencies in music. Instead of her simply draining your energy, there's a complex exchange occurring. It's almost as if your nervous systems are attempting to synchronize with each other. Lionel stared at Dar. Zhang in shock, her carefully maintained composure completely abandoned in favor of what appeared to be genuine scientific curiosity mixed with alarm. That should be impossible. Humans do not possess the neurological structures necessary for energy resonance with NYTH-Mari physiology. Maybe some humans do, Nathan suggested, noting that the strange tingling sensation had stabilized into something that felt oddly comfortable, like settling into a warm bath after a long day of physical labor. Maybe that's why you really came here. Not just to warn us about danger, but because something about our energy signatures was different from what you expected to encounter. Lionel seemed genuinely confused now, her certainty about fundamental aspects of her own nature beginning to crack like overstressed metal under pressure. I do not understand what is happening to me. Then maybe it's time we figured it out together, Nathan said, surprised by how natural the suggestion felt despite the extraordinary circumstances surrounding it. The next several hours passed in a blur of technical discussions, cautious experimentation, and the kind of awkward conversation that inevitably occurred when two entirely different species attempted to understand each other while potentially deadly energy patterns swirled between them like visible electricity. Dar. Zhang had transformed the station's small laboratory into something resembling a combination of scientific research facility and first-contact diplomatic meeting room, with monitoring equipment tracking the electromagnetic interactions between Nathan and Lionel while they sat across from each other at a table that had been hastily cleared of geological samples and replaced with instruments that beeped, hummed, and occasionally displayed readouts in colors that definitely weren't part of standard scientific protocols. Chief Vasquez had taken over the task of restoring their navigation systems, a process that involved extensive cursing in 3 different languages and the kind of percussive maintenance techniques that suggested she was either brilliantly intuitive about mechanical systems or preparing to beat their shuttle into submission through sheer force of will. The energy exchange appears to stabilize when you maintain conversational interaction, Dr. Zhang reported, studying readouts that made very little sense to anyone who hadn't spent years studying exotic physics and electromagnetic field theory. It's as if emotional engagement creates a buffer against the parasitic drain effect that Lionel described. Parasitic, Lionel repeated, her expression darkening with what looked like self-loathing. An accurate and appropriately unflattering term for what my species does to other life forms. Not necessarily, Nathan said, leaning back in his chair while being careful to maintain the physical proximity that seemed to be stabilizing their unusual interaction. Parasitism implies one organism benefiting at the expense of another. But if Dr. Zhang is correct about the energy exchange being bidirectional, then what you're doing might be more accurately described as symbiosis. I do not benefit from this interaction. Don't you? Nathan gestured toward the monitoring equipment, which was displaying energy patterns that looked like visual representations of music translated into mathematics. Your bioelectrical readings have been growing stronger and more stable since we started talking. Either that equipment is malfunctioning in very specific ways, or being around humans isn't quite as purely destructive for you as you've been led to believe. Liana was quiet for a long moment, studying the readouts with an expression that suggested she was reconsidering fundamental assumptions about her own existence. The NYTH Mari collective taught that interaction with other species inevitably led to their destruction. It was why exile was considered the only ethical choice available to those who developed empathy for potential prey. Maybe the collective was wrong, Nathan suggested. Or maybe they were right about some species but not others. Maybe what you need isn't complete isolation, but the right kind of contact under the right circumstances. You speak with remarkable confidence for someone who learned of my existence only hours ago. Nathan grinned, feeling more relaxed than he had any right to feel given that he was apparently participating in the first recorded case of peaceful human energy vampire diplomacy. Overconfidence in the face of incomplete information is basically humanity's defining characteristic. We've built an entire civilization on educated guesses, stubborn optimism, and the assumption that most problems can be solved if you throw enough creativity and determination at them. Despite herself, Liana's lips curved into what might have been the beginning of a smile, and Nathan noticed that the laboratory's lighting stopped flickering when her mood improved. That would certainly explain your species' expansion patterns and your apparent willingness to establish mining operations in nebulae that most intelligent beings would consider too dangerous for permanent habitation. Hey, our expansion patterns got us here, where we could have this conversation. I'd call that a pretty successful outcome. Dr. Zhang looked up from his instruments with an expression that managed to combine scientific excitement with growing alarm. Captain, I'm detecting some concerning fluctuations in the station's power grid. The patterns are different from what we've been observing, more aggressive, less controlled. Something other than our guest's influence. The energy signatures are distinctly different. More chaotic, more predatory. It's as if something else is drawing power from our main reactor, but through methods that are far less subtle than what we've been experiencing. Liana's expression shifted to one of unmistakable alarm, and Nathan felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees as energy patterns around her began crackling with visible electricity. No. They cannot have found me here. Not so quickly. They. A hunting pack. NYTH Mari who have dedicated themselves to tracking down exiles like myself. They must have detected my energy signature when I materialized aboard your station. More of your people. NYTH Mari who have completely embraced our predatory nature, Liana explained, her voice tight with fear that seemed to be as much for Nathan and his crew as for herself. They view my self-imposed exile as treason against our species' true nature. They believe that beings like us should feed without restraint or conscience. Chief Vasquez's voice crackled over the intercom with the kind of urgency that suggested their day was about to become significantly more complicated. Captain, we've got multiple contacts approaching from the direction of the nebula's core. They're not showing up on conventional sensors, but the gravitational detectors are displaying readings that don't correspond to any known vessel configurations. Nathan stood, his hand automatically moving to his sidearm despite the growing suspicion that conventional weapons would be entirely inadequate for whatever they were about to face. How long until they reach us? At their current rate of approach, maybe 15 minutes. But Captain, these energy signatures are unlike anything I've ever seen. They're orders of magnitude more powerful than what we detected from Liana. Liana, what exactly are we dealing with here? A hunting pack typically consists of 3 to 5 individuals, each capable of draining the life force from dozens of beings simultaneously. They have had centuries to perfect their predatory abilities, and they will not distinguish between you and me. Your entire crew will be consumed to fuel their power. And our options for dealing with this situation? You have none, Lioness said bluntly, though her expression suggested that admitting this caused her considerable pain. Even if your weapons could harm them, which is highly unlikely, they possess the ability to phase through solid matter and manipulate energy fields in ways that make conventional defenses useless. What about you? Can you fight them? Lioness's expression grew conflicted, cycling through emotions that seemed to involve fear, resignation, and something that might have been determination. I have not used my abilities in combat for decades. I chose exile specifically to avoid the violence that defines their existence. Against a full hunting pack, functioning at their peak capabilities. But you could try. I could die alongside you instead of being forced to watch you die. I suppose that represents a form of choice. Nathan found himself oddly moved by her willingness to make what amounted to a suicide gesture on behalf of people she had known for only a few hours. Or we could try something different. Work together. You understand their abilities and limitations, we understand human military tactics and the layout of this station. Maybe combined we can come up with something they won't expect. You would trust me with your lives. Lioness, you've been trying to save our lives since the moment you arrived here. At this point, trusting you seems like the most reasonable option we have available. Dar. Zhang was still monitoring his instruments, but now his expression carried a note of excitement that seemed entirely inappropriate given their circumstances. Captain, the resonance patterns between you and Lioness have been steadily strengthening throughout our conversation. If my calculations are correct, that synchronization might actually enhance both of your capabilities rather than simply preventing energy drain. Enhance how? Her energy manipulation abilities could be amplified by your bioelectrical field, while your nervous system could gain temporary resistance to the kind of energy-based attacks these hunters apparently specialize in. Temporary? Well, temporary in the sense that the effect would last as long as you maintained physical contact and emotional synchronization. Think of it as a form of psychic partnership that creates mutual enhancement rather than parasitic drain. Nathan looked at Lioness, noting the way her eyes seemed to hold starlight when she was hopeful, the way her pointed ears twitched when she was nervous, the way her entire being seemed to vibrate with barely contained energy that could either create or destroy depending on how it was directed. What do you think? He asked. Want to try something that's never been attempted before and will probably get us both killed, but might possibly save everyone on this station? That may be the most foolish proposal I have heard in 47 years of exile. Is that a yes? For the first time since he'd met her, Lioness smiled without reservation, and Nathan felt as if he were seeing sunlight after a very long period of darkness. Yes, Nathan Cross. That is unequivocally a yes. The hunting pack's approach created distortions in local spacetime that made the station's hull groan and flex in ways that suggested the fundamental laws of physics were experiencing technical difficulties. Emergency lights began flashing throughout the facility as automated systems detected energy patterns that exceeded every safety parameter in their programming. Nathan stood in the central corridor beside Lioness, their hands clasped in what Dr. Zhang had termed bioelectrical synchronization, and what felt to Nathan like holding hands with someone made of controlled lightning and concentrated starlight. The sensation was indescribable, as if his nervous system had suddenly expanded to encompass energies and perceptions he'd never imagined possible. 3 contacts confirmed, Chief Vasquez reported from her position behind a hastily erected defensive barrier that probably wouldn't stop a determined house cat, much less beings capable of manipulating energy at the molecular level. They're phasing through the outer hull now. Remember the plan, Nathan said to his crew, though calling their desperate improvisation a plan was probably overly generous. We're not trying to destroy them. We're trying to survive long enough for Lioness to convince them that humans represent something other than a convenient source of nutrition. And if the diplomatic approach doesn't work, then we improvise. Creatively and with extreme prejudice. The first hunter materialized in the corridor with the casual arrogance of a predator entering territory it considered its own. Where Liana possessed otherworldly beauty, this being radiated menace that seemed to exist on both physical and psychological levels. Its features were sharp and angular, its pointed ears even more pronounced than Liana's, and its eyes glowed with an inner fire that spoke of centuries spent viewing other species as prey to be consumed rather than beings worthy of consideration. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that made Nathan's teeth ache and his vision blur around the edges. Exile. You have contaminated yourself with contact from inferior beings. The collective's judgment upon your actions will be swift and absolute. Kethval, Liana replied, her voice steady despite the energy patterns crackling around them like visible electricity. These humans are not what the collective believes them to be. They possess characteristics that suggest ancient Nythmari heritage. Impossible. The seeding protocols were abandoned millennia ago when we discovered their ultimate futility. Were they abandoned? Or were they simply forgotten during the chaos that followed our transformation into predators? A second hunter materialized behind the first with the fluid grace of something that existed only partially in normal spacetime, followed quickly by a third whose energy signature made the station's lights flicker in patterns that suggested reality itself was experiencing some form of electrical disturbance. Nathan felt Liana's grip tighten on his hand as their combined bioelectrical fields blazed brighter in response to the increasing threat. "You speak heresy," the first hunter said, its voice carrying undertones that seemed designed to inspire terror in anything with a functional nervous system. "These creatures are parasites upon the galaxy, consuming worlds without regard for ecological balance or the rights of indigenous species. They must be eliminated before their plague spreads further. Just like the Devourers eliminated us." Nathan interjected, surprised by the authority in his own voice and the way it seemed to resonate with harmonics that hadn't been there moments before. Judged as a threat to galactic stability and marked for destruction without trial, negotiation, or any attempt to understand what we might have contributed to the universe if given the chance. The hunters paused in their advance, their attention focusing on him with the kind of uncomfortable intensity usually reserved for specimens under scientific examination. Nathan felt their collective gaze like a physical pressure against his consciousness, probing and evaluating in ways that made him deeply grateful for whatever psychic shielding his connection with Liana was apparently providing. "It speaks with knowledge of ancient history," the second hunter observed, its tone carrying notes of curiosity that seemed to surprise even itself. "How does a short-lived species possess awareness of conflicts that occurred before their star system achieved stellar stability?" "More than curious," Liana said, her voice gaining strength from their bioelectrical synchronization. "He resonates with our energy patterns at frequencies that should be impossible for unmodified human physiology. He can interface with our consciousness, share our perceptual modalities. This entire species may represent the return of genetic traits we believed lost when the seeding protocols were discontinued." "Prove this claim," the first hunter demanded, though Nathan noticed that its aggressive posture had shifted slightly towards something that might charitably be described as wary interest rather than immediate hostility. Nathan felt Liana's energy flow through their connection like liquid starlight, and suddenly he could perceive the hunter's emotional states as clearly as if they were speaking their thoughts aloud. Beneath their predatory confidence and centuries of practiced menace, he detected uncertainty, profound loneliness, and something that might have been hope struggling against the weight of endless disappointment. "You're not really hunters," he said, the words emerging from insights that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his individual consciousness. "You're refugees. The collective sent you to eliminate perceived threats, but what you actually want is to find a way home, a way to reclaim what your people lost when survival required you to become predators rather than the explorers and artists you once were." The third hunter, who had remained silent during the exchange, stepped forward with movements that seemed to bend space around them. "How do you possess knowledge of our inner nature? What connection grants you access to thoughts we have shared with no other being?" "Because loneliness recognizes loneliness," Nathan replied, feeling the truth of the statement resonate through their shared consciousness. "Because the desire to be something more than what circumstances forced you to become is universal among intelligent species. Because anyone who has spent centuries in exile would want exactly what you want, the chance to return to being explorers instead of predators, artists instead of destroyers. The energy patterns swirling through the corridor began to shift, becoming less chaotic and more harmonious as the emotional tenor of their interaction moved from imminent violence towards something that resembled actual communication. Nathan could feel the change, like music becoming more melodic, like discord resolving into harmony. The collective will not accept deviation from established protocols, the first hunter said, though its tone had lost much of its earlier certainty. Contact with other species invariably results in their destruction. This has been proven through millennia of experience. Has it? Lyanna asked. Or has contact been so brief that the energy exchange never had time to stabilize into symbiosis rather than parasitism? How many species did we encounter for mere hours or days before their life force was completely consumed? How many might have developed resonance compatibility if given sufficient time? You suggest that our fundamental understanding of our own nature is flawed. I suggest that maybe your people gave up on the possibility of peaceful coexistence too quickly, Nathan said. Maybe if you had remained in contact with other species long enough to understand what was happening, you would have discovered that energy exchange could benefit everyone involved rather than simply feeding the stronger at the expense of the weaker. Dar. Zhang's voice crackled over the station's intercom system with barely contained scientific excitement. Captain, I'm reading unprecedented energy harmonization throughout this entire section. Whatever you're doing, it's not just preventing conflict, it's actually enhancing our power generation systems and improving efficiency across all station operations. Nathan looked around and realized that the flickering lights had not only stabilized but were now providing illumination that was somehow both brighter and more pleasant than their normal artificial lighting. The air itself felt cleaner, charged with energy that seemed to invigorate rather than drain. We're not consuming the station's power, he said, understanding flooding through him like sunrise after a long night. We're amplifying it. Creating a resonance field that enhances everything it touches instead of destroying it. The first hunter consulted a device that appeared in its hand like crystallized thought, its expression cycling through emotions that seemed to range from disbelief to cautious wonder. Impossible. Energy vampirism is parasitic by definition. Symbiotic energy exchange is a theoretical concept that exists only in ancient texts describing pre-war Nythmari civilization. Unless it's not vampirism at all, Nathan replied, feeling knowledge flow through their connection that seemed to come from sources beyond individual memory. Unless what your people evolved was something entirely different that only became predatory when contact was too brief for proper synchronization to develop. You suggest that prolonged contact creates beneficial symbiosis rather than destructive parasitism. I'm suggesting that maybe your people never stayed in one place long enough to find out what prolonged contact might create. Maybe the fear of causing harm prevented you from discovering that harm wasn't inevitable. The hunters exchanged glances that carried entire conversations in frequencies Nathan was only beginning to understand. Their aggressive postures had completely disappeared, replaced by something that looked like beings who had been offered hope after centuries of believing hope was impossible. This requires extensive consideration, the first hunter said finally. Consultation with others of our kind who have questioned the collective's absolute commitment to isolation and predation. There are others. More than you might expect. Exile breeds perspective, and perspective often leads to doubt about truths that once seemed absolute. Many of us have wondered whether there might be alternatives to endless wandering and feeding. There will be resistance to these concepts, the second hunter warned. The collective has based its entire social structure on the assumption that we are inherently predatory beings who must remain separate from other species to prevent galactic genocide. Change is never easy, Nathan acknowledged. But the alternative is continued isolation for everyone, and that seems like a waste of potential for all our species. Lyanna squeezed his hand, and Nathan felt their combined energy signatures pulse in patterns that seemed to communicate hope and determination and the kind of cautious optimism that came from discovering that problems you'd thought were impossible might actually have solutions. Will you carry word of what we have learned here? She asked the hunters. We will, the first hunter replied. Though understand that transformation of thought patterns established over millennia will require time and patience. We have time, Nathan said. And we're apparently pretty good at patience when it comes to working out complicated interspecies relationships. The hunting pack departed as suddenly as they had arrived, leaving behind only faint energy traces and the lingering sense that something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between their species. The station's systems continued to hum with enhanced efficiency, as if their brief experiment in cooperative energy exchange had somehow optimized everything it touched. 5 days later, Nathan stood on the observation deck watching Chief Vasquez make final adjustments to power systems that were now operating at nearly twice their designed efficiency. The resonance field generated by his ongoing connection with Liana had somehow transformed their aging mining equipment into technology that performed better than anything in the Colonial Mining Administration's databases. Dar. Zhang thinks we've accidentally invented a new form of energy production, he said to Liana, who stood beside him with her hand resting comfortably on his arm. He's already drafting papers that he claims will revolutionize our understanding of bioelectrical field theory. And what do you think we've invented? I think we've proven that connection is possible between species that everyone assumed were fundamentally incompatible. That's probably more important than energy production, though the improved power efficiency is definitely a nice bonus. Liana was quiet for a moment, watching the colors of the nebula shift through the viewport in patterns that seemed to reflect their harmonized energy fields. Nathan, what we have discovered changes everything I believed about my nature, my purpose, my possibilities for the future. I am no longer certain who I am supposed to be. Then maybe that's the perfect opportunity to decide who you want to be instead of accepting what other people told you that you had to be. And if I choose to remain here? To explore what this connection between us might become if given time to develop properly. Nathan turned to face her fully, noting the way her pointed ears twitched when she was nervous, the way her eyes seemed to hold entire galaxies when she was hopeful, the way her presence made everything around them feel more alive and full of potential. Then I'd say you've made the best decision either of us has made in a very long time. Even knowing the uncertainties. The risks. The possibility that we're venturing into territory that neither of our species fully understands. Especially knowing all of that. The best discoveries usually come from exploring territory that nobody understands yet. She laughed, that musical sound that seemed to harmonize with the station's humming systems and create resonances that made the air itself feel more pleasant to breathe. You are an extraordinarily unusual human, Nathan Cross. You're an extraordinarily unusual energy being, Liana of the NYTH Mari. I think that makes us well matched for whatever comes next. Indeed. She moved closer, her energy field synchronizing with his in patterns that Dr. Zhang was still trying to map and understand. Perhaps it is time to explore what true symbiosis means when two beings choose connection over isolation. I thought you'd never ask. As they stood together on the observation deck, watching the nebula paint space in impossible colors, Nathan reflected on how completely his life had transformed in the span of less than a week. He was still a mining station captain with a tendency toward inappropriate humor and questionable decision-making skills, but now he was also part of something unprecedented, a living bridge between species, a proof of concept for cooperation across biological boundaries that had seemed insurmountable. It wasn't the career path he'd anticipated when he'd signed up for the Colonial Mining Service, but it was infinitely more interesting than extracting quantum crystals from asteroids for the rest of his natural life. Behind them, the mining station hummed with enhanced efficiency, its systems optimized by energies that neither human nor NYTH Mari science fully understood yet. But understanding would come with time, just as trust had come with willingness to look beyond surface assumptions and see the being behind the warnings. Sometimes, Nathan realized, the most dangerous thing about a person wasn't their capacity for destruction, but their capacity for transformation. And sometimes, the greatest risk wasn't in avoiding connection, but in refusing to explore what connection might make possible. He squeezed Liana's hand gently, feeling their combined energy patterns stabilize into something that felt like coming home after a very long journey through darkness. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and there would certainly be challenges as both their species adapted to new possibilities, they would face them together. It was, he decided, a much better outcome than being consumed by space vampires. Though he had to admit, even that would have made for an interesting story to tell at the next Colonial Mining Administration annual meeting. Assuming, of course, that anyone would have believed it.